Are you looking for Excel tips and tricks to boost your productivity? Well, here are 25 that you need to know. We'll cover tips like scenario planning, dynamic charts, and how to use my favorite Excel function. Download the free file from the description to follow along, and let's get started with tip number 1, adding a dynamic dropdown. Here I have a list of dates. To add a dropdown for these dates, I can just click Alt-A, V, or instead, just click on data validation over here. I can now select list and then highlight this range. Click OK, and now I have my dropdown. But what happens once I want to extend this list, let's say by one more row? As you can see, my dropdown doesn't reflect this, since I set the range to instead only end at C7. So what do? Well, I'll show you 4 ways that you can change that. Starting with my least favorite option, changing the reference to include a few extra cells, as such. I don't like this approach because now my dropdown has a blank space. And what happens if I add more values even past what I set? Well, my dropdown still won't pick it up. Well, another option can be to cut this cell, bring it all the way down here, and then copy the formula back down, pasting over this last cell. Now, if I hit my dropdown, you'll see it goes all the way to the bottom. And the reason for that is because my last cell here was what I initially had as the end of my range. So when I cut it and brought it back down, Excel extended the range to all the cells in between that. So this is better, but it's still pretty manual. I don't want to have to cut my cells each time my range actually extends. So how do we solve for this? Well, what we in essence need to do is create a reference to this range and somehow tell Excel to extend this reference if this range extends. Well, one of the ways that we can get a reference to automatically extend is via a table. So check this out. I'm just going to undo what we just did. So I'll just quickly convert this to a table by pressing Control T. So I'm going to name this date table. Okay, so notice that we have this little marker over here. Well, that tells us this is where the table ends. So if I add new data by just copying and then pasting this as such, you'll see that the marker then expands. So if we can create a reference to this table column, we could set that for our dynamic dropdown. But there's just one problem. You can't really set a column as a range in a dropdown of a table. So let me just show you what I mean. If I come over here, if I go to list, then I say equals date table, and then date as such, and then click OK, I get this nasty error where Excel is saying, hey, I'm not gonna let you do that. Instead, I can create a named range with this syntax. So I'll select this range, I'll hit Alt M and then M again, or hit define name. Let's call this date list, and I'm gonna make the scope only accessible in this specific tab, and we're going to make this date table, and then in the brackets we'll make it date as such for the column name. All right, now let's go ahead and click OK, and now let's go back and enter in our data validation. So I'll again click on data validation over here. This time I'm going to click on list, and I'm going to write equals date list, our newly created named range. I'll click OK, and now as you can see, I have my information. If I extend this range, well, let's see what happens. Looks like it's working. Great, but there's one more option that's even better, and that's to create a spill range. So let's go ahead and delete this table by clicking on table design and then convert to range. And I'll click yes. And let's just get rid of all of these values over here. I'm just gonna keep this one as such. And I'm going to actually create a spill range by writing equals date. For the year, I'll select 2024. For the month, I'm actually going to utilize the sequence function. So I'll type in sequence. Then for the amount of rows, let's go ahead and select 6 rows. I'll go ahead and close this off, and then I'll hit a comma and then 1. Let's go ahead and close the parentheses and hit enter. And let's just take the formatting and ensure that it copies all the way down as such by clicking on paste over here and then pasting formats over here. Okay, looks like my range now extended, and if I go ahead and change this to a 7, the information continues to extend. So for now, all I need to do in order to get this dropdown to refer to this dynamic range is again, open up my data validation, and this time point directly to this cell here and add a hash symbol. This tells Excel that this range is a spill range and that it should collect all the results of that spill range. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And now, as you can see with my dropdown, all of the values appear. If I change this to a 10, again, all of my values appear as such. And let's now move on to trick number 2, unpivoting data. See this view right here? Well, it's easy for our eyes to digest, but it's not so easy to manipulate via formulas. For example, let's say that I have our cost of goods sold and I want to pull the value as it relates to the start date and end date. So for all values over here, I want to sum up that information. How can I pull in that value? Well, I can't really use sum ifs because I need to pull information in multiple directions and the KPI may change. And I can't use XLOOKUP because I need to sum my values as opposed to just pulling one specific value. Now, I'll actually show you a formula soon that you could use under this view that will accomplish this, but instead, it's much easier to unpivot this via Power Query. So first, I'll go ahead and create a named range. So I'll select this range, and again, I'll click on Define Name. Let's call this P and L, and then I'll go ahead and click OK. Now I'll click on Data from Table or Range, and this is going to pull up the Power Query Editor. This is where we'll be able to unpivot our data. First, let's click on Use First Row as Headers, and let's change this over here to read Account. Now I'm going to right click this column over here and I'll click on Unpivot Other Columns. Look at what just happened. I now have a date for each account and value. I can change this over here to date. And let's go to Transform, Date, and then hit Parse. Perfect. Now I can click on File, Close and Load To, and I'm going to choose a table. That table is going to go inside my existing worksheet, and I'll put that right over here. Let's go ahead and click OK. Great. Now let's just change the table design to have no design as such. And let's update the formatting here to instead be for numbers as such. Great. Now, as you can see, revenue for January 2024 showcases here. If I change this to 50,000 and then I right click over here and hit refresh, you'll notice that the value over here updates to 50,000. So going back, now I can use a sum ifs because all of my information will be analyzed on a vertical basis. So I could just type in equals sum ifs. I could say, give me all of the values if the account over here is equal to this value, if the date over here is greater than this value, and if the date over here is less than or equal to this value over here. Let's go ahead and close the parentheses and hit enter and check it out. Looks like my value works. COGS for January and February actually doesn't equal this value, but that's because February had a leap year. So if I change this to 229, now you'll see that the information actually updates. And while we're on the topic of tables, let's talk about how we can add these beautiful buttons to this table, which is really called a slicer. So I'll just click into my table, I'll click into table design, and then I'll click insert slicer. For my slicer, I'm gonna choose that to be the account, and I'm gonna click OK. All right, now let's just fix the formatting a bit. Let's make this 3 columns wide, and I'm just gonna hold down Alt, point this over here, and continue to bring this up as such. All right, now I am going to right click and then click on Slicer Settings. I want to remove the title over here, so I'll just click on Display Header, and I'll remove that by clicking OK. Great, now let's do just one more thing by removing this border. So I'm going to click back into the slicer, I'm going to click over here, which is the current style that we're on, and we're just going to duplicate it. Now for the whole slicer, I'll just click on Format, then for border, I'll select None, and then I'll click OK, and OK once more. Now I'll select that newly created format, and as I click away, you can showcase over here this beautiful slicer with no borders. And I can hold down Shift and everything will just return back to normal. Tip number 4, text to columns. Okay, this is an easy one. See this cell over here? It showcases all of my months in one cell. And instead, I want them to be spread over multiple cells. So I'll click Data, Text to Columns. Now I'm being asked if my data is delimited, where I could showcase the character that I want to split the cell by, or fixed width, which will just split it at an even space. I'm actually going to click on delimited, where I can showcase so you can see what it's like under this view. I'm going to click on Other over here. I'll uncheck Tab. I'm just going to enter in a space. And looks like Excel already picked it up. So I'll just go ahead and click on Finish. And then I'll click on OK. Great, now all of my dates just spread to each column. Tip number 5, transposing data. Building off of our last exercise, I now want to take this information and instead of it showing horizontally, I want to make it go vertically. Well, there are actually 2 ways to do this. Option 1, highlight the text, copy it, come over here, go to Home, paste special, and then click this over here for transpose. Another way is even simpler, and that's using another spill function, this time the transpose function. So I'll type in equals transpose, select this entire range over here, close the parentheses, and then hit enter. Tip number 6, remove duplicates. Just like you can transpose data in multiple ways, you can also remove duplicates in multiple ways. So let's cover 2 options. Option 1 is with the remove duplicates button. So to start, I'll select this range over here. I'll go to data, remove duplicates. Now Excel is asking me if I have my data as a header and it's confirming that it comes from the columns. So I'll go ahead and click OK. And now I get this pop-up saying that 5 duplicate values were found and removed, 6 unique values remain, and that there may be empty cells or spaces. I'll go ahead and hit OK, but let's actually try this with a different method. I'll undo what we just did. This time I'll use a different spill function called unique. So I'll type in equals unique. I'll select this entire range over here, and then I'll close the parentheses and hit enter. Now I can just come in and select this range, copy it, come over here, hit Alt-H-V-R to copy over the formatting as such. But instead of removing duplicates, let's embrace duplicates with our next tip, duplicating a window. So here I have 3 financial statements that are all connected together. If I make changes to my revenue, well then my net income amount updates over here, as does my cash flows, where it pulls in that net income amount. But I don't want to have to flip back and forth between all these tabs. I want to see my updates in real time. Well, that's really simple. Just hit View, New Window. Now you can see that there's a 2 and a 1 above each of these screens. So I'll just bring this all the way to the right, and I'll bring this one all the way to the left. And now, as I make changes to, let's say, my cost of goods sold, you can see the real-time impact of the changes right over here. But there's actually one more way that you can monitor the values of a cell without duplicating your window, which brings me to tip number 8, the watch window. Navigate to formulas and then hit this watch window over here. You could actually take this over here and stick it as such to go beneath the ribbon. Let's click on add watch and let's choose the cell that we want to monitor. So I'm going to monitor our cash flows in Q1. I'll go ahead and hit add. Now my cash flows is being monitored. So if I change this to a 20,000, you'll see that the value then updates directly from the cash flows, and I could track it at all times right over here. Tip number 9, Excel's camera tool. Back to my financial statements, I want to be able to track what exactly is happening with my cash flows at all times. Well, that's really easy to do with Excel's camera tool. So first, I'm going to click this button over here to add it to my toolbar. I'll go ahead and click on more commands. Instead of popular commands, I'll change this to all commands. Now let's scroll down until we get to the camera tool. Let's add it to our toolbar and click OK. Great. Now I could showcase what exactly is happening with my ending cash at all times by selecting this here, clicking this camera icon, coming to my profit and loss, and then clicking this button right here. Now I have my information from my cash flows, and as I update this number over here, you'll see that this updates as well. Let's do the same thing for our balance sheet. Great. Now I have both my cash flows and balance sheet right next to my profit and loss. So as I make changes to my profit and loss, all 3 of these will update. Tip number 10, want to explore different scenarios? Well, Excel has a built-in scenario manager where you can toggle real easily to different scenarios. So here I have 3 scenarios, a base, then a ceiling, which takes 10% more of each value from the base, and then the floor, which takes 50% of each value from the base. To toggle between each of these, I'll just hit Data, What If Analysis, and then click on Scenario Manager. I'm going to hit Add, then call this over here Ceiling. For changing the cells, I'll click this button over here and I'll select all of these cells that I want changed. I'll then hit OK. Now Excel is asking me how exactly do I want to change these cells. So I'll manually type in what I have under each cell under Ceiling. And I'll just quickly fast forward as I enter in all of these values. Great, now I'm gonna do the same thing this time, adding cells for floor. So I'll come back over here, I'll again select these cells, and this time I'll enter in values that correlate with the floor condition. Great, now we have these 2 scenarios. I'm gonna actually add now the base scenario as well. Perfect. Now I can just go ahead and hit show, and Excel will update for all of the scenarios that we have selected. Our last trick was cool, but what if I want to see the results of multiple scenarios in just one view? Here I have revenue and cash flows for all of 2024, and the amounts are summed over here in this column. These two cells allow me to understand what my values would look like if they had a growth factor. So if I just enter in 5% over here, you'll see that my revenue grows by 5% each and every single month, and the total gets populated over here. But what if I wanted to see the results of, let's say, a ceiling scenario where I grow by 10% every month, a base scenario where I grow by 0%, and a floor where I actually decrease by 10%? Well, that's what I could do with data tables, as you can see over here. So let's recreate this view for our cash table. So to do that, I'll first link the top right cell over here to the value that I want to track. Then I'll enter in each of my scenarios in this column here, and I'll select the entire table. Now I'll go to Data, What If Analysis, and this time I'll hit Data Table. Now Excel is asking me where exactly are my inputs of my scenario. Is it in a row or is it in a column? It's actually in a column, and the input is affected by this cell over here. When we change this cell, all of these cells over here will update. So that's what I'll go ahead and click, and then I'll click OK. Notice that Excel now updated all of the information as such into a dynamic data table. So I could see what things would look like if it's just a base over here of me not growing, or if I grow by 5% every month, or negative 5%, as we can validate as I change this over here to 5% and then negative 5%. Now, a few things to note about data tables. First, you can't come over here and just change a value, or you'll get this error message as such. Instead, you'll have to delete the entire range. Next, data tables can slow down your Excel file. So to be extra safe, you can click on Formulas, Calculate Options, and then hit Automatic except for data tables. And while we're on the What If Analysis button, let's go through the last option with tip number 12, finding an exact value with Goal Seek. Over here, I want to know what my COGS needs to be if I want to obtain a gross margin of 65%. So I'll click on What If Analysis, Goal Seek, and then I'll set cell D7 to 0.65 by changing cell D5. I'll then click OK, and Excel calculated that my cost of goods sold needs to be $17,500 in order to achieve a gross margin of 65%. Tip number 13, transporting data by inserting cut cells. So here I have a profit and loss. The auditors told me that merchant account fees can actually go in expenses instead of cost of goods sold. This is great because that means that my gross profit and gross margin will be higher, making me more attractive for investment. Well, in order to move this information to, let's say, below conferences and events, you could come over here, hit the insert button, then cut, and then paste, but that's a lot of steps. And now I have to come over here and delete this as such. Let's undo that and instead use insert cut cells. So again, I'll come here, I'll hit Control X to cut. This time I'll right click on the row and I'll click insert cut cells. Now the information transported by deleting the old reference and inserting a new line right below conferences and events. To do this even more quickly, you can select this range again by hitting Control X, select this range, and then just hit Control plus. Tip number 14, sum ifs or with Sumproduct. Here I have a range of data and I want to sum the values if they equal either account 1 or account 2, but they have to be greater than my start date and less than or equal to my end date, as you can see. Well, let's build this formula together using Sumproduct. So I'll type in equals Sumproduct, open parentheses. Then I'll enter another open parentheses and select this range as such. Let's close the parentheses, hit an asterisk, which tells Excel that we want to multiply the next condition as such. I'll then say that the dates over here need to be greater than my start date. I'll hit another asterisk and say that my dates need to be less than or equal to my end date. Now for my last condition, I'm going to open two parentheses, one parenthesis to say that my account needs to equal this account over here, close parentheses. This time I'll plus because I want it to be an or condition, open a new parentheses and say that my accounts need to equal account 2 as such. Let's close this parentheses, close the parentheses once more, and then one final time and hit enter. and check it out. Our value now updates. If I change this to 3.1, and if I change this instead of marketing to payroll fees, all of my values dynamically updates. Now you wouldn't really be able to do this with the sum ifs because again, sum ifs only goes in one direction. You also wouldn't be able to do it with an XLOOKUP because that generally just finds one value. It's a lookup value. The Sumproduct function is a lot more versatile. Now, you may be wondering what exactly is happening with this formula behind the scenes. Well, that is what brings me to tip number 15, evaluating your formula. This can be a great mechanism for how you could actually evaluate what is happening in a cell as it calculates. So all you need to do is hit evaluate formula and then keep hitting evaluate, and Excel will walk you through what exactly is happening in real time. If there's an error, you can trace at what point exactly the error took place. I'll link to a full video on Sumproduct in the description below. But first, we got to move on to tip number 16, and that is how to create conditional formatting with a custom rule as such. You may be curious as to how exactly I got my cells to update based off of the dropdowns that I selected over here. Well, in order to do that, I use conditional formatting with a custom rule. So let's first go ahead and just take this information and create a separate table for how exactly we want this formatted. So I'm going to say equals and I'm going to say, if I am in this cell over here, again, I want to create a mirror of these cells. If this date over here is greater than our start date, and this date over here, which I'm going to again lock on the row because I'm going to drag this through all cells, is less than or equal to the end date. Then I'll write an OR function and say, if this over here for our account, and I'll lock the column, is equal to this, comma, if this over here, again, lock the column, is equal to our second account. Close the parentheses and then close the parentheses once more. Let's now drag this all the way across. And as you can see, we now have 2 true over here and 2 true over here. That is going to coincide with what exactly we should highlight. So I'm just going to come in here. I'm going to copy this formula. I'll select this entire range. I'll go to conditional formatting, new rule, and then I'll click use a formula to determine which cells to format. I'll just paste this as such. And to format it, I'm going to set the fill to be this light green. Let's go ahead and hit OK and OK once more. And there you have it. Now I could again change this value and my information will update just as it updates over here. So when setting a condition for conditional formatting using a custom rule, you want to think about what the top left cell in your range is going to have to read for true or false. But just like we can create a custom rule with conditional formatting, we could also create a custom rule with custom formatting. So here I have a table that shows the month and the collections amount that I could expect to receive from my invoices. -1 means a month before I send the invoice out, I'll get paid, and 1 means 30 days later or 1 month later, I'll collect 50%. I want to improve the legibility here, so I'll select all of these cells and I'll either hit Control-1 or this little button right here under font. I'll then come to number and I'll go to custom. Now the way custom formatting works is you enter in values in between these semicolons. So anything entered to the left of the first semicolon is what things would look like whenever it's positive. So let's go ahead and write month, space, close the quotation, and then hit pound with 3 pounds after that. Next, this is going to show us what things would look like if it's a negative value. So remember we said we have a negative value over here as our first value, which means someone pays a month before. So let's instead say pound months before and then close the quotation. Now Excel is actually showing me what this preview looks like because this is the first value here and our value is negative. If the amount is 0, we'll just call it same month. Now I'm going to hit OK. And let's extend this a bit and notice how exactly this shows. This says 1 month before, this is the same month, and this is for every month after that. But what's really cool is that the identity of this cell is still a number and a formula. So if I, for example, just take this and add a 3 to it, now Excel will show month 4. Tip number 18, create a combo chart. So over here, I have 2 charts, one that showcases revenue, the other that showcases gross margin. I want to combine both of these though into one chart. Well, that's really easy with a combo chart. So I'll just select both of these charts. I'll get rid of them. Now let's create our chart by first selecting all of my range over here. I'll click on Insert, Recommended Charts. Then I'll go ahead under All Charts, click on Combo. Now here's the key. I'm going to go to gross margin and I'm going to make this a secondary axis as such, and I'll make this over here a clustered column. Let's click OK. Let's right click, then click Select Data, and let's get rid of COGS and gross profit. Now to finish this up, let's just make this a little bit prettier. So I'll hold down Alt so that it snaps to grid as such. Let's get rid of these grid lines. Let's right click over here and click on Format Data Series. I'll click on this paint icon and I'll click Smooth Line, and let's make this a yellow. And then over here, I'll change this instead to a dark line as such. Let's get rid of this. And now I have my combo chart. And that brings me to tip number 19, centering across selection. As you can see, I have a merge cell over here, which is an issue because if I select just this column, everything by default will then select. Well, instead of using merge and center, I could actually center across selection. So I'm going to go ahead and unmerge these cells as such. Now I'm going to take this, I'll select this whole range. I'll again click this arrow, then I'll go to alignment, horizontal, I'll click center across selection, and then click OK. Now my text appears as if it's centered across the selection, but in reality, it's only contained in this cell over here. Tip number 20, vertical headers. Here I have my profit and loss again, and everything is separated by quarters. I wrote quarterly over here and I merged these cells. The issue is I can't really read this. So let's just change the text direction, which is actually very simple. Just hit this button under the home ribbon, then we'll just hit rotate text up as such. Tip number 21, insert a timeline to a pivot table. Here I have a pivot table, and as you can see, this takes up a lot of columns for all of these dates. Well, let's instead add a timeline. So I'll just click onto the pivot table, under pivot table analyze, insert timeline. I'll click on date, and now I'll again hold down Alt to snap this to grid, and let's just drag this a little bit forward. Okay, now I could select a specific date, like for example, Q1 2024, by just holding down as such, and my pivot table will automatically update. Tip number 22, create a table of contents. Want more legibility in your Excel files? Don't make the mistake of thinking you'll be the only one using your Excel files. Odds are you'll be collaborating with your coworkers. That's why adding a table of contents can be so beneficial, and it's also so easy. Simply type out your tab names like I have over here, then hit Control K. Alternately, you can right click and then click on link as such. Now we'll click on place in this document. I'm going to navigate down to the profit and loss tab, cell A1, and click OK. Now, if I click this button, I'll be taken directly to the profit and loss tab. Tip number 23, insert icon into cell. Here I have a headcount dashboard and I want to add icons to better represent how many hires that I have. So I'll click over here, I'll click on insert icons, and then I'll type in person to find a good icon. Let's use this one over here. I'll go ahead and click on insert, and let's just copy this. And let's change this second one to be a light gray. For this one over here, we'll make this instead our yellow. Great, now there's one thing left to do. I wanna place this inside the actual cell. Well, you'll notice that I have this little icon here that says place in cell. So let's go ahead and click that. Now let's do the same thing for this one over here. Great, now I could just enter in numbers over here and I can change my formula to say equals if this is less than or equal to this, and let's just lock these as such, then pull in this value, otherwise pull in this value. Okay, looks like I placed it inside. Let's go ahead and copy this across, and now I have my headcount dashboard updated, and I can change this to a 6 or a 3, and everything will update. Tip number 24, let's create named ranges in bulk. Well, each of these I want to be a named range. I could come in here, go to formulas, hit define name, and type in start date, but that would just be a lot of work to do one by one for each item. Instead, I'll just select this entire range and click create from selection. Now Excel is asking me where exactly are the names from your selection. So I'm just gonna check the left column as such, which is where my names are contained. When I click OK, you'll notice that now I have a named range for each and every account that matches to what shows over here. Tip number 25, create a custom sort. Here we're back on my pivot table, and as you can see, I have each section, but it's not sorted in the correct order. That's because it's going alphabetically. Well, in order to change that, I'll need to create a custom sort. So I'll navigate to File, options, advanced, and then I'll come all the way down to edit custom list. Let's now add a custom list. So I'll type in revenue, cost of goods sold, gross profit, operating expenses, net operating income, other expense, net other income, and then net income. Okay, this looks good. I actually just have to change this from revenue to income. Now I can click add, and then I'll click OK. Now I could right click this over here, click on sort, and hit sort A to Z. Now this still isn't working, so let's hit Z to A, and then let's again hit A to Z to reset it. Now I have my sorting in the correct order. Way to go! You made it through all 25 tips. Check out this video right here for how to build a pivot table profit and loss entirely from scratch. And let me know which was your favorite in the comments below, and I'll catch you next time.